Aloha ka ko, ofodangi le'a katasa. Hi, I'm Karen Watson-Gegeo, which must be obvious. I'm very happy to be coming to you today by tape delay, as they say in television, although I would much rather be with you at the PacSLRF conference in Hawaii myself. For one thing, I have a lot of friends in Hawaii who I really miss. I haven't seen most of you since 1994, which is a very long time. Also, Hawaii is my second home, and I still feel that I'm a Department of Second Language Studies person, even though I'm far away. I want to thank the PacSLRF Organizing Committee for inviting me to give this plenary talk today. Mahalo nui loa, noku fatalea aomulu. The second language I'm speaking there is Quarter-ai, as some of you know. The title of my talk today is Mind, Language, and Epistemology Toward a Language Socialization Paradigm for SLA. We are at the beginning of a paradigm shift in the human and social sciences that is revolutionizing the way we view mind, language, epistemology, and learning, and that is fundamentally transforming second language acquisition, SLA, and educational theory and research. This paradigm shift is being stimulated by new research in the cognitive sciences, human and child development, first language acquisition and socialization, cognitive anthropology, cognitive linguistics, and the critical social sciences, including cultural and cross-cultural psychology. The shift is also prompted by the flow of research from the periphery to the center of political power. Third-wave feminist studies and ethnic studies from colonial and post-colonial societies, including currently colonized indigenous and ethnic minority peoples within dominant societies, are consonant with the new findings in the human sciences. And in turn, the voices of these scholars and their claims for indigenous and other standpoint epistemologies are supported by the new research. The emergence of formerly silenced voices is part of the contemporary process of globalization, in which peoples on the periphery, within and outside dominant or center societies, rather than being passively affected by globalization, are actively reacting to and participating in it. They are speaking on their own behalf to the centers of knowledge construction and power, to promote their own interests and the ongoing decolonization process. This remarkable and creative combination of socio-political events and trajectories in mainstream and non-mainstream research has already seriously eroded the universalist assumptions that until now determine mainstream theory and method, and that are anchored in Anglo-Euro-American cultural ontology and epistemology. The paradigm shift has begun to be felt in SLA scholarly social spaces through new cognitive science-based theories of language, including emergentism theory and criticalist sociocultural studies in SLA. And I very much regret that I wasn't able to be there last night to hear William O'Grady's talk, and I won't be there tomorrow either to hear Kevin Gray's talk on emergentism. I'm not spending time really on that in this paper, although certainly the understandings that are coming out of that work are included in what I'm talking about here. The conventional paradigm for SLA research had come under increasing criticism since the late 1970s for its exclusive reliance on Cartesian positivistic assumptions about reality, for its experimental modes of inquiry that cannot incorporate cultural and socio-political context into its models, for its basis in structuralist or other problematic linguistic theories, and for its inability to produce implications for pedagogy that actually work for second language teaching, especially in the periphery, that is, third and fourth world situations. However, recent developments have opened the way for a new synthesis involving a reconsideration of mind, language, epistemology, and learning, based on the recognition that cognition originates in social interaction and is shaped by cultural and socio-political processes. That is, cultural and socio-political processes are central in, rather than peripheral to, cognitive development. My purpose today is twofold. First, I will overview in outline fashion some of the diverse lines of research and thinking that converge on a set of general principles for cognitive development and social practice, yet to be understood in detail through further research. In doing so, I will highlight some of the subtleties and issues of social influences and experience in shaping mind and language skills that are under-theorized in SLA, and I will identify lines of work that have not yet entered SLA scholarly social spaces. Second, I will argue for a language socialization paradigm for SLA. Such a paradigm would be embracive of and consistent with the new research. Okay, new section. New understandings about mind and language from the cognitive sciences. What do we now know about cognitive processes and the human brain? The shift from cognition to mind in much of the research discourse on cognitive development reflects current understandings about the brain and thinking. First, neuroscience research has demonstrated that the body-mind dualism of Western philosophical and mainstream scientific thought, in which cognition rides in a sort of detached fashion above the body and is in some sense distinct from it, an idea still implicit in much educational and SLA research, is fundamentally mistaken. What we humans understand about the world, we understand because we have the kinds of bodies and potential for neuronal development that we have. Even our scientific instruments are an extension of our bodily capacities and built on the assumptions we make about the nature of reality, in other words, ontology, based on our own body's ways of detecting and relating to the world. All cognitive processes are thus embodied. Secondly, more than 95% of all thought is unconscious, what Lakoff and Johnson call the cognitive unconscious. And it is this unconscious thought lying outside our awareness that shapes and structures all conscious thought. Included in the cognitive unconscious is all implicit knowledge that we have learned through socialization beginning in the prenatal months. Third, mind is a better term than cognition because the latter tends to focus on only parts of the mind, typically what Vygotsky called the higher mental functions of voluntary memory, logical reasoning, language, metacognitive skills, and some forms of categorization. Most of our theoretical models of cognitive skills acquisition assume that these higher order cognitive skills are independent of other mental processes. However, through research on patients who have lost emotional capacity via brain damage, second-generation cognitive science has shown that without emotional capacity, people cannot make rational judgments, including moral decisions. Emotions are essential to logical reasoning. As developmentalist Kurt Fisher and his colleagues argue, Kurt Fisher being in child development, emotions, quote, have well-defined roles in human activity and are not opposed to cognition, as is assumed in Western culture. To the contrary, emotion links closely with cognition to shape action, thought, and long-term development, end quote. Fourth, our earlier conception of cognition has been further expanded to incorporate many other components of a human mental life, although not all components, and I'm going to come back to this at the very end, including symbolic capacity, self, will, belief, and desire. The work of Howard Gardner has also demonstrated that human beings develop many forms of intelligences beyond those narrow cognitive skills that formal schooling and language teaching consider to be real or important. Fifth, not only is language metaphorical, but because of the kind of neural networks that we build in our brains, thought itself is metaphorical and made possible through categorization that is typically conceptualized as prototypes. Some categories and prototypes are inherent in the kind of being we are, the body and mind that we have, and therefore may be said to be universal. A great many, however, in fact probably the majority, are socioculturally constructed and therefore vary cross-culturally. Sixth, until now we have conceptualized the brain metaphorically as a container of intelligence, knowledge, and cognitive skills, and the individual as a container for the brain and as possessing or failing to possess societally desired cognitive skills. Our metaphor has thus very much determined the way we look at human thinking and behavior, and certainly the way we measure and assess the cognitive abilities of students in schools and language classes. Some of the most interesting research in human development over the past several years has upended this conception of cognition. Research demonstrates that, quote, both the content and process of thinking are distributed as much among individuals as they are packed within them, end quote. This is a quotation from Michael Cole and Iriyo Engström. Michael Cole, of course, being an important cognitive scientist and developmentalist. The discovery of distributed cognitions, that people think in conjunction with others, that cognition is socially constructed through collaboration, links to the work that is going on in cognitive anthropology and by standpoint epistemologists on the nature of knowledge construction. And I'm going to be coming back to that in a moment. What have we discovered about language from cognitive science research? First, research has discovered no structure in the brain that corresponds to a language acquisition device as argued by Chomsky and others. Language is not a human genetic innovation because its central aspects arise via evolutionary processes from neural systems that are present in so-called lower animals. There can be no pure syntax apart from meaning, emotion, action, and other dynamic aspects of the mind in communication. Linguistic concepts, like all other cognitive processes, arise from the embodied nature of human existence and through experience. Language develops through the same general processes as other cognitive skills, and grammar is a matter of highly structured neural connections. Second, innateness is usually equated with language universals. However, consistent with cognitive science, emergentism, connectionism, and cognitive linguistics, what we take to be universal typically involves universals of common human experience starting after birth. In other words, it's not just a matter of what we are born with, but the fact that we human beings occupy a set of environments with and in which our body-mind has co-evolved. In other words, we have co-evolved with our environment. We've affected the environment and the environment has affected us, and that present us with common experiences. These experiences include, as Lakoff and Johnson phrase it, quote, the conceptual poles of grammatic constructions, universals of spatial relations, and universals of metaphor. The rest is culturally variable and/or shaped by gender, ethnicity, social class, and socio-historical, socio-political processes in very powerful ways that affect perceptions, assumptions, language or languages, and other understandings of the world. Third, language structure, language use, and language acquisition are inseparable because experience shapes all our neuronal networks. These processes are therefore also shaped by socio-historical, socio-cultural, and socio-political processes. The latter issues are at the heart of ontology, epistemology, and learning. To move into issues of ontology and epistemology, we first need to examine what we currently understand about how knowledge is organized by and in the embodied mind. So, new section, ontology, cultural models, and epistemology, understandings from cognitive anthropology and the voices of the other. Ontology refers to what there is, and epistemology to how we know. Work in cognitive anthropology over the past 2 decades has revisited the once discredited issue of linguistic relativity, and through empirical research has demonstrated that differences in language do have a significant impact on differences in thinking. There's quite a lot of publications along this line, but one of my favorites is the edited volume by John Gumpertz and Steve Levinson. The title of that is Rethinking Linguistic Relativity, and it was published in 1996. This work is closely related to empirical research on cultural models for thinking and behaving by cognitive anthropologists using schema and prototype theory. In turn, the work on cultural models is parallel to research by psycholinguist Catherine Nelson and her colleagues on children's language development, which also draws on schema and script theory. Catherine Nelson's book also came out in 1996 and is titled Language in Development, The Emergence of the Mediated Mind. Nelson argues that, quote, human minds are equipped to construct complicated mental models that represent the complexities of the social and cultural world, end quote. She proposes the term mental event representation, MER, for the basic flexible structures of children's cognitive development in the form of schemas and scripts that become a mental context for future behavior in similar situations. Cognitive anthropologists argue that culturally shared knowledge is organized into cultural models, defined as, quote, prototypical event sequences in simplified worlds. This quotation coming from Naomi Quinn and Dorothy Holland's book on cultural models. Cultural models frame and interpret experience and guide a variety of cognitive tasks, including setting goals, planning, directing action, making sense of action, and verbalization. They operate below the surface level of behavior and the linguistic level of morphology and syntax to shape perception, information processing, and the assignment of values. So in other words, they are part of the cognitive unconscious, although we can make them conscious. Analytically, cultural models are compatible with the neuronal network model of the embodied mind. Typically in psycholinguistic research, the complex interrelationships among forms of cultural knowledge across domains are not addressed. In contrast, an important insight from cognitive anthropology is the relationship between cultural models and the systematic or thematic nature of cultural knowledge. Quinn and Holland argue that this thematicity is the result of, quote, a small number of very general purpose cultural models that are repeatedly incorporated into other cultural models, end quote, in hierarchical and other arrangements. General purpose models or premises operating across cultural domains give a culture its distinctiveness and reduce the total amount of cultural knowledge to be mastered by the learner. And I have an example of this that's kind of elaborate that I can share with you from Quater I if it's of interest and if we have time during the question and answer period. Knowledge encoded in cultural models is brought to bear on specific tasks in the form of metaphorical proposition schemas and metaphorical image schemas. I think it's important here to realize that these terms, proposition schema, image schema, are heuristic for analytic purposes only. A claim is not being made here that this is necessarily the way that they are encoded in the mind, although people, the particular proposition and image schemas I'm going to give you are actually stated by people in the cultures involved. A proposition schema specifies concepts and the relations which hold among them, such as, among white middle-class Americans, argument is war. And we can follow out the entailments of this at great length, which Quinn and Holland have done. We talk about taking a position in an argument. We talk about conflict of opinion, about marshaling our forces, about defending, attacking, winning, losing, defeating, and so on. However, contrast this argument is war, which is the white middle-class American view of argument, not their only view of argument, of course, but one major one, versus in Quater I in the Solomon Islands, where my husband David Gegeo, who most of you know too, and I have conducted research for more than 2 decades, argumentation is straightening out. Quite a different idea. Or to take another example from Quater I, families share food without expectation of return. And this is contrasted with relationships in which exchange is the expectation. An image schema is far more gestalt-like and usually metaphorical, such as the American image schema, marriage is a journey. And you can follow that out for yourself. We talk about stormy weather, we talk about difficult road, etc., going different directions, and so on. Or the Quater I image schema, extended family members are all one hearth, or one basket, household, garden, cluster of baking stones, any of those will work. Now this latter image schema in Quater I means that extended family members are all one family, and thus the proposition schema, families share food without expectation of return, applies to all of them. Cultural models, which are usually tacitly understood and often unconscious, lie at the heart of cultural identity, ontology, and indigenous epistemology. Until very recently, ontology and epistemology were treated as what Western philosophy and science had invented, while everybody else had worldview and common sense strategies for discovering knowledge needed to survive in the local environment. Today, scholars from third world societies and from indigenous societies living under colonial conditions in first and second world societies are challenging the privileging of Western ontology and scientific epistemology. This challenging has come in the wake of the critique of mainstream epistemology by third-wave feminist scholars against the Anglo-Euro-American patriarchal positioning of mainstream epistemology. Epistemology refers to both the theory of knowledge and theorizing knowledge. Epistemology is concerned with who can be a knower, what can be known, what constitutes knowledge, sources of evidence for constructing knowledge, what constitutes truth, how truth is to be verified, how evidence becomes truth, how valid inferences are to be drawn, the role of belief in evidence, and related issues. Social epistemologists and feminist epistemologists recognize with sociologists of knowledge that epistemological agents are communities rather than individuals. In other words, knowledge is constructed by communities, epistemological communities, rather than collections of independently knowing individuals. And, quote, such communities are epistemologically prior to individuals who know, end quote. This comes from Lynn Nelson, who is a feminist epistemologist. Feminist epistemologists, parallel to neuroscientists, recognize the embodiment of knowledge. Elizabeth Gross has cogently argued that the current crisis of reason in Western culture and philosophy is, quote, a consequence of the historical privileging of the purely conceptual or mental over the corporeal, end quote, and the inability of Western knowledges to conceive their own processes of material production, processes that simultaneously rely on and disavow the role of the body. That second part was also a quote. Both of these points are consistent with the new findings of cognitive science and developmentalist research we have just reviewed. However, feminists add the additional and crucial insight that human bodies are not all the same. In particular, Western positivistic research typically assumes a male body and usually a white, middle-class, heterosexual male experience of and in the world. Moreover, the feminist and third world challenge to Western rationality and normal science takes all these arguments a step further to challenge the taken-for-granted objectivity on which much of Western science depends for its claim that the knowledge it produces is necessarily universal and always superior to other forms of knowledge. Particularly relevant to the present discussion is standpoint epistemology, as developed by feminists, which recognizes that, quote, knowledge claims are always socially situated, end quote. This is from Sandra Harding. That is, all knowledge is subjective, positioned, that is to say, from a standpoint not objective in some final sense, historically variable and specific, even when what is constructed turns out to have universal implications. With the realization that all knowledge is situated comes the recognition of the importance of who gets to be the knowledge producers versus who are only allowed or able to be knowledge consumers, and why there is so much power in the hands of those who control knowledge. Knowledge is political as well as cultural. For researchers, this raises the issue of who gets to represent whom. Typically, it has been white Anglo-Euro-American researchers who study and represent mainly non-European others, who are not allowed voice to represent themselves as they wish to be or are positioned. As postmodern feminist Anna Yateman puts it, quote, who must be silenced in order that these representations prevail, end quote. These power relations are in a very early stage of changing, brought about by the new research on indigenous epistemology by third world scholars writing about their own cultures. By indigenous epistemology, Gegeo and I mean a cultural group's ways of thinking and of creating, reformulating, and theorizing about knowledge via traditional discourses and media of communication, anchoring the truth of the discourse in culture. As a concept, Indigenous epistemology focuses on the process through which knowledge is constructed and validated by a cultural group, and the role of that process in shaping thinking and behavior. We have argued that Indigenous epistemology assumes all epistemological systems to be socially constructed and informed through socio-political, economic, and historical context and processes. Culture is, of course, variable, an ongoing conversation embodying conflict and change, shaped by the dialectic of structure and agency, referring here to Giddens, inherently ideological and prone to manipulation and distortion by powerful interests, citing Foucault, Gramsci, Habermas. However, people do undertake their own critical reflection on culture, history, knowledge, politics, economics, and the socio-political context in which they are living their lives. They do act on these reflections, and in all known societies, there exist formal contexts for direct teaching of cultural knowledge and values. The recognition that all knowledge is positioned and situated in socio-historical, socio-political contexts brings us to the questions: what do the new understandings about body-mind imply for context? And how do people learn? Okay, new section. Contemporary understandings of human development, situated learning, and context. The new research has made older cognitivist theoretical assumptions about development and learning obsolete. One of the best accounts of how our understandings have changed is found in the National Academy of Sciences book published in 2000, titled From Neurons to Neighborhoods, The Science of Early Childhood Development. First, quote, human development is shaped by a dynamic and continuous interaction between biology and culture. The national panel states that the nature versus nurture debate is thus, quote, scientifically obsolete. Second, genetics and environment not only affect, but are affected by a child's agency. In other words, what a child chooses to do, the action that a child takes in development. This is true also of adults, but they're focusing here on children because children have been somehow assumed not to have agency. The transmission model of development and socialization is therefore also scientifically obsolete. Not only adults, but also children are active participants in their own development and help to shape their environments. Third, the idea that development is entirely and necessarily universal with regard to the specifics of stage and trajectory is now obsolete. Quote, the effects of culture on child development are pervasive, the panel declares. Continuing the quote, culture influences every aspect of human development and is fundamental to what happens. That culture is formative entails the influence of the family and family organization. Today, there is a turn towards seeing the family as a unit of analysis rather than the individual child. Some of the leading human development departments in American universities are changing their names to reflect this new emphasis. For instance, the department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison recently changed its name from Child Development to Child and Family Studies, and faculty there have begun collaborative research projects using qualitative and ethnographic research. And a year ago, they hired my former doctoral student who finished his PhD last year, Jeffrey Lewis, brilliant African-American scholar who did his field research on child development in a Mixtec village in Mexico. They hired him to bring this perspective, much of this new research that I'm talking about today, to that department, and especially to bring ethnographic research methods to the faculty there. I think we need to realize that renaming departments is often indicative of a paradigm shift. Fourth, critical period as a description or boundary for certain kinds of development is now a dispreferred term, the panel says, having been replaced in cutting-edge research by sensitive period. Research has found that the developing brain is open to influential experiences across broad periods of development. Drawing on activity theory, critical psychology, ecological psychology, and cognitive anthropologist, Jean Lave defines learning as, quote, changing participation and understanding in the culturally designed settings of everyday life, end quote. She points out that cognitivist theories of learning have heretofore claimed that, quote, actors' relations with knowledge and activity are static. That is, they do not change except when subject to special periods of learning and development. And that institutional arrangements, like schools, for inculcating knowledge are the necessary special circumstances for learning separate from everyday life. End quote. The weight of evidence, however, is moving towards sociocultural theories that emphasize learning as ubiquitous, as an aspect of all activity. In any situation, people will learn, even if what they learn is to fail, an all too common consequence of formal education. Underlying the split between older cognitivist theories and contemporary sociocultural theories of learning is an epistemological gulf. Older cognitivist theories viewed knowledge as a collection of real entities located in heads, the container metaphor again, and learning as a process of internalizing these entities, what Freire called the banking model of education, in which deposits of prepackaged knowledge are made into the heads of students. In contrast, sociocultural theories, which are receiving support from the new research, regard knowing and learning as engagement in changing processes of human activity. This latter part of the sentence being a quote again from Lave. Even as cognitivist theories have not recognized the heterogeneity of knowledge, they also do not take into account situated activity, and that, quote, conflict is a ubiquitous aspect of human existence. As we have seen, power issues cannot be detached from knowledge, and thus all learning is political in nature. Then what is meant by situated cognition and situated learning? Both terms have wide usage today in various pedagogical fields, where their meanings are often diluted and sometimes diluted. Situated cognition refers to the position that, quote, every cognitive act must be viewed as a specific response to a specific set of circumstances, end quote. It's a quotation from Lauren Resnick, developmental psychologist. This framing of cognition challenges experimental psychology and psycholinguistics' assumptions that the research laboratory or a test-taking situation is a neutral environment in which valid findings about people's skills can be discovered and or measured. Research has shown, for instance, that children's conversational inexperience, rather than their cognitive incompetence, can produce inaccurate results about their abilities in an experimental situation. Research has also shown that adults often attend to figuring out the social meaning of the experimental situation rather than to the cognitive features of the task given them. In short, there is no decontextualized neutral environment. Everything occurs in and is shaped by context. Situated learning refers to more than the idea that learning takes place somewhere and through doing, or that the meaning of activity depends on social context. Situated learning is a general theoretical perspective on the, quote, relational character of knowledge and learning, the negotiated character of meaning, and the concerned, engaged, dilemma-driven nature of the learning activity for people involved in it. Thus, there is no activity that is not situated. The whole person is involved in learning, and agent, activity, and the world mutually constitute each other. This is a quote from Lave and Wenger. A situated learning perspective rejects the notion that there can ever be decontextualized knowledge or a decontextualized activity. By definition, everything that happens in the human world is in a context with specifiable characteristics. Even so-called general knowledge can be learned only in specific contexts. And the usefulness of general knowledge is only in its applicability to renegotiating or reconstructing meaning in specific circumstances. Context is also a much more complex concept than is usually recognized in SLA research. From an activity theory point of view, context is, quote, historically constituted between persons engaged in socio-culturally constructed activity and the world with which they are engaged. This is quoting again from Lave. Ongoing social structure shapes, but do not fully determine context, since context is also partly negotiated, and all interactions involve contradictions and political dimensions. Meaning is relational, that is, among individuals and activity systems or institutions. Context is open and is partially renegotiated in every action, but it is not completely so. It is the fluid, dynamic, complex, heterogeneous nature of context that is usually reduced to a list of features or elements in SLA research, a mistaken notion of how context is constructed in interaction and across time and space. The social construction of cognition and learning challenges our basic notions of cognition, even as second-generation cognitive sciences challenge these notions. Social structures are often hidden and taken for granted, yet can influence our assumptions about cognition, assessment of cognitive skills, and pedagogy. Leigh, for instance, has pointed out that our society's organization around capitalist production and exchange of commodities creates a metaphor in which work can be divided into sets of separate activities and skills. As Lauren Resnick, the developmental psychologist again, argues, this is a quotation from her, "What we take as knowledge in school and to a large extent in cognitive research reflects the assumption that competence can be decomposed into its constituent parts and decontextualized for purposes of instruction and evaluation without losing anything essential. So, our very definition of the cognitive is subtly colored by assumptions that derive from social and economic arrangements with long historical roots. The social, then, invisibly pervades even situations that appear to consist of individuals engaged in private cognitive activity." End quote. How can we move SLA theory onto a firm grounding that takes into consideration the new research we have just reviewed and found to be converging across the social, human, and behavioral sciences, and creates a more realistic and useful basis for research and practice? I suggest that a language socialization paradigm for SLA would resolve many of these issues and have significant application to language teaching. New section, toward a language socialization paradigm for SLA. As a theoretical and methodological perspective, language socialization, or LS, began as a response to concerns with the narrowness of mainstream first language acquisition and child development research models of the 1960s and 1970s, and the realization that language learning and enculturation are part of the same process. Since the early 1980s, a series of rigorous, detailed studies of children's language socialization have been undertaken in a variety of societies, interestingly enough, especially in the South Pacific, including Papua New Guinea, Bambi Shiplin's work, of course, Samoa, Eleanor Oakes, of course, Solomon Islands, and Hawaii, and also in Africa, Asia, Europe, and in the diverse cultures of the U.S. mainland. More recently, language socialization studies of second language, or L2, classroom learning have begun appearing. Most L2 studies have thus far exhibited a variety of serious weaknesses, including the need to disambiguate cultural from situational effects, the need to interrogate key analytic concepts, unsupported interpretive leaps from data to cultural pattern, lack of contrastive examples where these are essential to assessing the quality of the analysis, and less than transparent procedures of data collection and/or analysis. For a review of the better LS studies and SLA, I suggest reading the paper that Sarah Nielsen and I have done for Kathy Doty and Mike Long's Handbook of Second Language Acquisition that's going to be coming out here pretty soon from Blackwell. Rather than reviewing existing studies here, I want to move us towards an LS paradigm for SLA by briefly laying out some of the key premises of LS theory. We need to recognize that a new paradigm will be socially constructed by an epistemological community, not individually announced, and certainly not by me this morning, and that what we are seeking to build here is an open and not a closed paradigm. In other words, we are not seeking to construct a new grid or new walls. We are instead opening up spaces. The basic premise of LS is that linguistic and cultural knowledge are constructed through each other. and that language acquiring children and adults are active and selective agents in both processes. The learning of language, cultural meanings, and social behavior is experienced by the learner as a single, continuous, though not linear, process. Learners construct a set of linguistic and behavioral practices that enable them to communicate with and live among others in a given cultural setting. This premise is fully compatible with the new research findings on mind, language, epistemology, and learning that we reviewed earlier. A second premise of LS theory is that all activities in which learners regularly interact with others in the family, community, or classroom are not only by definition socially organized and embedded in cultural meaning systems, but are inherently political. People learn language or languages in social, cultural, and political contexts that constrain the linguistic forms they hear and use, and also mark the social significance of these forms in various ways. These insights apply to second language learners as well as first language or L1 learners because, as we have seen, learning is ubiquitous. There is no context-free language learning, and all communicative contexts involve social, cultural, and political dimensions that affect which linguistic forms are available or taught and how they are represented. This premise is also consistent with the new research on mind, language, epistemology, and learning. A third premise of LS theory has to do with levels of context essential to analysis. It has become clear in SLA research over the past decade that social identities, roles, discourse patterns, and other aspects of context all affect the process of language learning, including motivation and consciousness. And of course, the important paper on consciousness is being done by our very own Dick Schmidt. Too often, however, the treatment of aspects of context in SLA is reductionist and superficial. Ellis and Roberts' approach to context, for example, claims to draw on Heim's heuristic work, but in fact follows Brown and Fraser's reductionist approach in limiting context to a few dimensions. Roberts and Simono want to deepen context beyond such narrow uses, they say, yet they reduce context to only 3 levels in their analysis, omitting many historical and sociocultural dimensions that cannot be precluded in advance. In contrast, in LS, context refers to the whole set of relationships in which a phenomenon is situated, incorporating macro levels of institutional, social, political, and cultural aspects and micro levels involving the immediate context of situation. The history of macro and micro dimensions, including interactants, individual experiences, and the history of relationships and interactions among them are important to the analysis. In this respect, LS study aims to go beyond Geertz's notion of thick description, which he actually borrowed from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle's. And in fact, you know, he ripped it off from Gilbert Ryle, so he gets all the credit, and it's really Ryle's who came up with this notion. But anyway, we want to go beyond thick description to thick explanation. Thick explanation takes into account all relevant and theoretically salient micro and macro contextual influences that stand in a systematic relationship to the behavior or events to be explained. With systematic relationship is the key for setting boundaries, and with attention to data collection to the point of theoretical saturation. This premise of LS theory is consistent with the new understandings about the ubiquitous and fundamental role of context in human experience. A fourth premise of LS theory, also supported by research, is that children and adults learn culture largely through participating in linguistically marked events, the structure, integrity, and characteristics of which they come to understand primarily through verbal cues to such meanings. The construction and learning of syntax, semantics, and discourse practices is especially fundamental to learners' socialization in framing and structuring their development of both linguistic and cultural knowledge, including ontology and epistemology. Second language classrooms exhibit and teach, with varying degrees of explicitness, a set of cultural and epistemological assumptions that often differ from those of the L2 learner's native culture. Certainly such differences have been well documented for linguistic and cultural minorities in a variety of national and international settings, and have often been shown to be problematic for child and adult L2 or second dialect learners. A fifth premise of LS theory incorporates the insights on cultural models and mental event representations from cognitive anthropology and Nelson's work in human development. What this means is that cognition is built from experience and is situated in socio-historical, socio-political contexts, as argued by Lev. The construction of event representations and other cultural models is the building of new neuronal networks or links between networks, from the perspective of cognitive science. Because cognition is created in social interaction, contemporary LS theory is concerned with participation in communities of practice and learning. More specifically, the learning process which Lev and Wenger call legitimate peripheral participation. They emphasize the crucial importance of learners' access to participatory roles in expert performance of all knowledge skills, including language. The term legitimate peripheral participation refers to the incorporation of learners into the activities of communities of practice, beginning as a legitimated or recognized participant on the edges or periphery of the activity, so that's legitimate peripheral, and moving through a series of increasingly expert roles as learners' skills develop through participation. Capacities and skills are therefore built by active participation in a variety of different roles associated with the given activity over a period of time, from peripheral to full participant. Lev and Wenger have thus moved beyond the Vygotskian notion of internalization, you'll notice there's a container metaphor there, into a more fluid, realistic, and criticalist perspective on learning. Their theory of social practice is related to the work of Giddens and Bourdieu, and is congruent with what cognitive anthropologist William Hanks describes as, quote, the radical shift in the human sciences from invariant structures to ones that are less rigid and more deeply adaptive, with structure more the variable outcome of action than its invariant precondition, end quote. Lev and Wenger's formulation speaks to the, quote, to the relational interdependency of agent and world activity, meaning, cognition, learning, and knowing, and emphasizes the inherently socially situated negotiation and renegotiation of meaning in the world. That's from Lev and Wenger. This perspective is important to focusing our attention on how learners are brought into or excluded from various activities that shape language learning. The importance of studying access, negotiation, and the roles of L2 learners' movement from beginner to advanced L2 speaker status is foregrounded. These issues have critical importance for linguistic minorities and immigrants who often face social and political hostility or exclusion and may react with resistance. Moreover, if we were to take Lev and Wenger's legitimate peripheral participation model seriously, L1 and L2 classrooms would need to be dramatically changed to maximize learning. New section, methodological issues for second language socialization. I'm not going to go much into methodology here, I just want to say a few things. An LS paradigm is eclectic with regard to research methods and design, but emphasizes ethnographic and other forms of qualitative research as the key empirical methods. In the past few years, a number of discussions of qualitative and ethnographic methods in SLA and ESL research have appeared. One of the very best is by Kathy Davis, one of our own. But only two so far flow from an LS perspective. Quality LS research requires a combination of ethnographic, sociolinguistic, and discourse analytic methods at a minimum, and often includes quantitative and sometimes experimental methods as well. However, quantitative and experimental work must be ecologically valid, as Michael Cole and his colleagues have written extensively. That is, incorporate all relevant macro and micro dimensions of context, and going beyond the psychologist's notion of ecological validity, incorporate whole events and behavior rather than short strips of time with coding into preset categories. LS research is built on fine-grained, longitudinal studies of language and culture learning in community and/or classroom settings, systematically documented through audio tape, videotape, and careful field note records of interaction. In-depth ethnographic interviews of learners are conducted, focused around interactions, patterns in data, and theoretical issues salient to the research questions that evolve grounded theory style from accumulating data and continuous analysis. And I refer you for further discussion to the chapter that Sarah Nielsen and I are doing for Kathy and Mike's book. Oh gosh, we will just ignore that. In fact, we'll let it ring, and then I will end with my conclusion. I'm very sorry about that. It never occurred to me I needed to unplug the phone before starting this. Anyway, conclusion. A language socialization paradigm would transform SLA research, making it consistent with the new research in the human, social, and neurosciences, and making it more relevant to learners' actual experience. An LS paradigm would also transform the way we attempt to teach languages in classrooms. We would have to re-examine our pedagogical strategies, the assumptions we make about classroom organization, lesson structure, and effective materials. Our concern with multiculturalism would be radically changed as well, from the rather superficial and anemic treatment of cultural variability to a serious and intensive consideration of how our perceptions of the world are shaped by the interaction between our embodied experience in the world and the culturally based ontology or ontologies and epistemology or epistemologies into and through which we are all socialized in the course of learning our first language or languages and culture or cultures, and then re-socialized or partially re-socialized in the process of learning a second or third or fourth language and culture. Moreover, political issues in language, mind, culture, interaction, ontology, epistemology, and learning would be foregrounded rather than set aside as peripheral or ignored altogether. We would have to ask ourselves and our students, why are we teaching or learning English or another language? What does this teaching or learning imply in our highly diverse but rampantly politically structured world? What is the political implications of our teaching, learning, and researching language learning and pedagogy? Who does this work empower, and who does it disempower? Finally, I want to briefly address an aspect of human experience that is missing from the new neuroscience research. There actually are several, but this is the one I'm going to address today, and which probably will make some of you uncomfortable. So let me begin from the periphery. In all known human societies, the, quote, schism between transcendentality and appearances is recognized, using the phrasing here of Woutischer in the introduction to his 1998 edited volume, Tribal Epistemologies, Essays in the Philosophy of Anthropology. In the West, we divide spirituality from science. Even those scientists who themselves experience or are open to the notion of spirituality tend to separate spiritual matters from their daily professional work. This is not an unimportant issue, because for most indigenous and ethnic minority peoples, spirituality and the sacred are at the core of their indigenous knowledge systems. Many third and fourth world peoples feel that when their languages and cultures are recorded and analyzed by Anglo-Euro-American researchers, they are desanctified in both the spiritual and the epistemological sense. When indigenous and ethnic minority peoples talk about their indigenous ontologies and epistemologies, much of what they say, quote, falls outside any perspective consistent with our age of reason, end quote. This is again from Woutischer. He goes on to say that our own experiences with aspects of body-mind which we cannot explain, such as intuition or intention, are, quote, ubiquitous and show that our 20th century sense of science is incomplete. Objectifying methodologies cannot account for qualitative experiences, while introspective methodologies collapse under the scrutiny of noetic, that is, intellectual intrusion, end quote. In Western science, with the exception of a few pioneers who have been typically vilified, we have closed off from reality-grounded science, as we see it, the recognition of the strong human seeking for transcendental meaning. The resulting dichotomy resembles the body-mind dualism that has been so physically and emotionally destructive to us since Descartes, and which is now crumbling under the weight of evidence from a variety of methodological perspectives. We need to remember that simply because we cannot measure something And simply because we cannot find a structure somewhere, given our current primitive methods of research, does not and should not close our minds to a way of knowing. Part of the postmodern realization is that knowledge is now going to move from the periphery of world power to the center, instead of always from the center to the periphery, as has been the case under colonialism. In closing then, a paradigm shift of the dimensions I have attempted to outline in this presentation is going to be painful for all of us. A paradigm shift shatters the old in the interest of making room for new growth and new visions. By definition, paradigm shifts question all that we hold dear, all that we have assumed, the theories that are close to our heart, the methods we have believed in, the goals we have set for our careers. In this case, normal science, which we have taken to be the hallmark of our very technologically oriented and distorted society, is from here on challenged. It will be a new kind of science, far more holistic and open than in the past, integrating more of human experience and understanding than in the past. It will incorporate voices and knowings from the periphery of world power, from standpoints of indigeneity, ethnicity, color, gender, and sexual orientation. As noted chemist Ilya Prigogine comments, quote, "The world is far too rich to be expressed in a single language. Music does not exhaust itself in a sequence of styles. Equally, the essential aspects of our experiences can never be condensed into a single description. We have to use many descriptions which are irreducible to each other. Scientific work consists of selective exploration and not of discovery of a given reality. It consists of the choice of questions which have to be posed," end quote. Mahalo and tagio tu mas. I look forward to speaking with you soon on the telephone.